I remember people coming into my writing studio when I was working on, the first version of Dead Boys. And someone asked me, what are you doing? Like, physically, what are you doing? Because this looks insane. And I explained, well, I do a handwritten draft into this notebook here, and I would show them the notebook, and it was like 2 lines of print to every line for some reason. And then I will type that into a word processor. Then I'll print that out. Then I'll rewrite it in between the double-spaced lines on the page. Then I'll type that back in. Sometimes I'll print it out and then I'll type it into a typewriter, and then I'll handwrite it again sometimes just to get like a better, feel for it. And there was a published author who came in and was like, this is crazy. You're not supposed to do this. I don't think that this is right, and I don't think that you should be doing this. And I was just like, well, they can't stop me.
Hey, I'm John.
I'm Corey.
And this is The Passage,
the podcast where authors break down their favorite pieces of writing,
taking you behind the scenes from the first spark of inspiration
to the final edits and everything in between. Gabby Squailia is an author and professional DJ who lives in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts. She is the author of 2 novels, Dead Boys and Viscera, that I had the immense pleasure to be a part of back in my editing days. Both books occupy a fuzzy, hard-to-define space where fantasy, weird fiction, and horror intersect. Dead Boys is set in the afterlife, where the very lively dead taxidermy their own bodies to slow the decay of flesh. Viscera, on the other hand, is set in the land of the living, but one of the main characters seemingly can't be killed. Gabby's work is equal parts macabre, funny, poignant, philosophical, and is always bursting at the seams with ideas. I am a complete sucker for excessively imaginative world building in speculative fiction, and both of these books have it in spades. So Gabby, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I read this passage earlier when you sent it. I've been excited to talk to you about it since I got it. Can you set up the passage for us? Can you sort of tell us what we need to know going into it?
Absolutely. This is at the very beginning of the book, so not much has transpired. But at this point, we know that we are following Jacob Campbell. He's a preservationist, so he is sort of like a plastic surgeon who revamps corpses who are starting to fall apart. And he is on a quest to find a seer at like a fortune teller at the top of South Heap, which is essentially a huge garbage pile that has swept up from the shores of the River Lethe. And so we begin right there, almost on the first page.
Awesome.
Just beyond the edge of the path, an upended water tower was half buried in a mound of debris, and beyond its rusted curve lay a view of the River Lethe unparalleled in the city proper. Jacob, despite his unmoving lungs, gasped. Its purplish waters were wide and slow-moving. The motionless corpses that floated on its surface were surrounded by glittering shoals of refuse and roiling rainbows of oil. There, past the bobbing shape of a claw-footed bathtub, was the stretch of river bend where he'd thrashed out of the mud and onto his newly lifeless feet nearly a decade ago. With this unexpected glimpse of his point of deathly origin, it all came rushing back. How, after days of toil, he'd propped his numb body up on one palm, then another, only to lose his purchase in the slippery mud and splash face first into those amniotic waters, where the whole humiliating process began anew. Giving his full attention to his footsteps, Jacob was surprised at how well-tended the interrupted path became as it led to the seer's door. Someone had packed it down, forcibly and recently. Stepping lightly now, he rubbed his reupholstered palms together, the high-pitched scrunch of their leather soothing his mind. "Greetings!" he cried, jerking one hand over his head. But as soon as he'd had a good look into the murk of her chamber, he choked on his prepared speech. From the roof to the rust-bitten curve of the floor, the room was packed with filth-encrusted children's toys. Quilts and blankets spewed moldy down onto jacks-in-the-box with broken springs. Board games missing their pieces served as tables for eyeless dolls. In the center of the candy-colored sprawl sat the seer known as Ma Hicks, her body so thoroughly ravaged by time that Jacob felt a professional ache at the sight. From forehead to foot, her skin was full of holes, flashing elbows, cheekbones, and knuckles alike. Her face was a soiled handkerchief, askew on her skull, incapable of expression. "My name is Jacob Campbell," he said, steadying himself enough to bow. "I come with a gift, and an uncommon question." Ma Hicks still hadn't moved, but at the sound of his voice, something within her did. Startled, he staggered backward, fixing his attention on her belly. She must have been near her 9th month of pregnancy when she'd died. Since then, her womb had given way, and from its dark cavity 2 tiny skeletal feet emerged, dangling over the edge, kicking into the open air.
There's so much that I love about those paragraphs. There's this like these super weird, vivid images that start immediately. The upended water tower, the mound of debris. There's like all these things that sort of jump out. But what I kept thinking about as I was reading it and rereading it a couple times was there's this like real musicality to the language. It's poetic in parts. The reupholstered palms, the high-pitched scrunch. There's this line, "From the roof to the rust-bitten curve of the floor, the room was packed with filth-encrusted children's toys." There's almost a meter there. So I want to ask about all that stuff. But first, the most obvious question is, why did you pick this passage? What about it speaks to you after all these years that you wrote it?
Yeah, I think this was the proof of concept for me when I was first writing Dead Boys. Dead Boys had a long pre-production history. I thought of the sort of idea of this specific underworld and a lot about its topography and the way that it worked in about 2000. So I was like 21 years old, and I was sort of obsessed with this vision that I had, but I couldn't really come up with a way to work it into a story that felt convincing to me. This book went through a lot of different forms and even overall genres. It was storyboarded at one point, it was a play at one point, and I did toy with the idea of writing it in metered verse, which I think is a lot of where that DNA comes from.
Yeah.
And so for me to get to a point where I could write it as a story, I needed to have not just justification on the story level, but justification on the sentence level. And so I sort of came to this decision: if I'm going to do this, if I'm really going to commit to writing this thing all the way through with this idea that's been, tormenting me for 10 years, there has to be something that I think is awesome on every single page, every single sentence. It just has to be so dense with images that I can sell it to myself because I love everything, that's happening about it. But the reason that I like this especially is because the way that it came together for me was visual. And that was specifically around a concept of character development that I thought of as creating characters out of plasticine. They were stop motion animation figures, and I would set the way that they moved. And, there is a sort of lineage of that goes from, Dickens through Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast, where a character shows up and they have like a sign of physical action that they do every time, shake me up, Jenny, or whatever the thing is. And I wanted to take that into Nightmare Before Christmas territory and sort of push it into the character is the physicalization, is the method of death, is the method of preservation and the way that they move, their relationship to their corpse, and all of that stuff is locked. And that came together for me with Ma Hicks specifically when I had the concept for there's a fortune teller, but she's not the fortune teller, the baby is the fortune teller. And her, the baby has kicked so much that it's opened up the womb, and that's this cavern. And then, okay, so she's in this cavern, and then the baby's in this cavern. And once I could see that, I was like, all right, I'm in. Like, this is the first scene.
So did you have Ma Hicks before you had Jacob Campbell, the sort of protagonist of your story?
Yeah, it started with mock kicks. All I knew was there was someone who was traveling on their way to get a quest, to fulfill a quest, and then, around the concept of going to a fortune teller, the stuff about the living man started to fill in, and that's sort of, the justification for the story's action, such as it is. Although I think the story's action is 90% world building and like 10% plot to me.
I want to ask about something you said a little earlier, which is that you had this idea for a long time and you couldn't really figure out what the story was, and this kind of unlocked it. But what was the idea? What was the thing you had in your head that you need to create a story to contextualize?
I was 20 or 21 years old, somewhere in that range, and I was couch surfing in Dublin, in Ireland. And we went out to like a Dublin mega pub, and I was not familiar with this sort of environment at that point. Like, most of the places that we went to were not big corporate pubs, but it felt so overwhelming and so packed with people, and there were multiple bars, and it was just this overloading experience where I was used to a very cozy experience of going to a pub, with my friends in Ireland and like having a Guinness and, just like a quieter time. So this was fresh in my mind. And we went back to my friend Owen Bailey's apartment, who was kind enough to let me stay on his couch for several weeks. And we were listening to The Mollusk by Ween, and the song Blarney Stone came on. And
this is not the origin story I was expecting for.
You didn't expect Ween to factor into Dead Boys?
There was a spliff that was circling the room, and the song sounded to me like a barroom shanty that you would sing in the underworld. It sounded like, oh, these are dead people singing. And then I had this image of a pub that was the size of a football field, but underneath the earth. And everyone in it was dead, and they were just pouring, liquor down their throats, and it was coming out of their stomachs, and someone else is down there drinking the liquor that's coming out of the stomach. And it was just this very, bizarre, but very generative series of images around people who are dead, but they're still drinking, and they're drinking for eternity, and they'll never stop drinking. And that was the core to The City Underneath the City, which is, this series of pubs that forms part of the story. And I wanted to justify that. I wanted to put it in a story, but it's just really sort of a setting. And so I just was looking for more about that world and filling in, what started to be a pretty obsessive process of like, well, how does this work though? What are the mechanics behind The Nightmare Before Christmas? So you are dead, you can take off your head and like roll it around on your arms and then put it back. But how does that work though? And so that became the obsession for a while, was figuring out, essentially the magic system of animated corpses.
Is that a set of rules that you sketched out and wrote down? Is it just a bunch of ideas in your head like, oh man, that would be cool?
Yeah, I think it was all written down. There was a rule set that emerged. It was something between, like a magic system and a list of rules for animation. Because that was how I saw the book, was this was something that I'm animating in my head, and then I'm describing the animation.
Did you know to do that intuitively? Had you heard or read another author who did some sort of world building on the scale that you were thinking about doing and was like, oh, this is structure around how to make it all make sense, how to all keep track of it? Or did you kind of stumble and learn it organically as you went?
Yeah, it was all very intuitive, but also ass backwards. When I was starting to think like, oh, I think there's going to be a battle, like a huge war of corpses. How do you write a battle? What are the rules of that system? I should read the Iliad, and then you're just like, oh, this is nonsense. All of these battle scenes, there wasn't a map. There was, there weren't hexes. This is just someone's imagery of war. And once I started to understand that it was all just sort of poetry and visualization, I just sort of built everything backwards. But I think the process that I went through was painstaking. and seems a little silly to me now, but it was definitely just vibes and intuition. And just tons and tons and tons of reading with an instinct to ask questions and make up answers if I had to, but it was all just, I'm going to read 10 books that are about the afterlife. I'm going to, do all of this research and, try and figure out how do, different cultures around the world view death. What's the reality of death on a decomposing body? How does all of that stuff function so that I can piece together this, this system?
Do you remember how many iterations this particular passage? What were you doing back then? I mean, when I read some of this, It seems to me that it's, and I mean this in a really good way, that like it's been worked over. These words are these words are like, they're there for a reason. I mean, the phrase, I circled this when I read it, the unexpected glimpse of his point of deathly origin. That just seems like something that would take forever to come up with, but when you have it, it's exactly right. What was that process like? Writing, rewriting, revising?
That is an apt question. I remember people coming into my writing studio when I was working on, the sort of first version of Dead Boys. And I remember someone seeing the process, because you could see the process everywhere. There were just pages strewn all over the place and printed pages that had just been, lines crossed out, rewritten in tiny print on top of them, all over the place. And someone asked me, what are you doing? Like, physically, what are you doing? Because this looks insane. And I explained, well, I do a handwritten draft into this notebook here, and I would show them the notebook, and it was like 2 lines of print to every line for some reason. And then I will type that into a word processor. Then I'll print that out. Then I'll rewrite it in between the double-spaced lines on the page. Then I'll type that back in. Sometimes I'll print it out and then I'll type it into a typewriter, and then I'll handwrite it again sometimes, just to get like a better, feel for it. And every stage of the way, I'm reading it out loud and seeing how it feels. So I think on average, every page of Dead Boys probably had at least 12 drafts. It was, and the person that I was showing all of that to just said, this makes me physically sick. I don't want to see any more of this. If I had to write a book this way, I would rather die. And there was also like a published author who came in and was like, this is crazy. You're not supposed to do this. I don't think that this is right. And I don't think that you should be doing this. And I was just like, well, they can't stop me.
Yeah.
And this was all before, it got into Corey's hands. And then if you recall, we pretty much tinkered with every single sentence in that, already extremely worked over manuscript. So that began a whole other process.
I'm so fat. Like, I don't remember any of, maybe we never even talked about the sort of iterations that came to. Let me just start back at the beginning. Why handwrite the first draft? Where did that instinct come from? Is that something that you heard about another writer doing, or like, was it
that was Writing Down the Bones, Natalie Goldberg. And so I started out, like, my first attempted novel, I was like 12. And then around the time I was 15, I started to take it seriously, where I found Writing Down the Bones, and I started to write every day for at least an hour every day. And I would do, writing sprints, free writing exercises, but I would just write and not let my hands stop moving. And so I got very attached to the physical act of writing with a pen. And that for many years, and I would say even up until 6 months ago, that was how I drafted anything. The book that I'm working on currently, I went back to that and I wrote for about a year that way. And then I hurt my wrist because I'm old now. And so I can't just sit there and write for, 2-3 hours with a pen anymore. That will wreck me. So now I've made the jump into, fully typing into Scrivener, and that is working fine. But yeah, for years and years and years, it was the muscle memory, I think, of I'm writing and I can't stop. because I've got a timer going and this is how I do it. I'll do 45 minutes on, 15 minutes, take a walk. And that was the process for so long that it just felt so natural by the time I got to Dead Boys.
Do you really think about, okay, when I'm writing longhand, this is the particular way that I'm writing or the way that I'm approaching just getting the words out versus, okay, now I'm in the part where I'm typing things out on a typewriter. I'm in a different part of the writing process. I'm activating a different part of my brain. Do you distinguish between the different drafts or even the way that you are actually writing like that?
Well, I think there's a huge distinction in the way I write now and the way I wrote then. At that point, as I said, I was convincing myself, to write. There was a real sense that I needed to give myself permission to do this, and it was hard to come by. And so sort of writing by brute force was the pen part. Typing it in felt more like an interrogation of that, and then printing it out, I just always felt like, wow, there's still so far to go. Maybe I process this a few more ways. And it had to get to a point where I could read it out loud and not change anything. And then that was the finished draft. But what I used to do, which I don't recommend, is I would do that every chapter. So I would sort of get through to the end of one chapter and I would revise and revise and revise and revise, 12 times, however many times. And then when that chapter felt like it was locked, then I would start the next chapter. That is not at all how I, function anymore. And these days I find I am able to write into a word processor and it doesn't feel significantly different. The voice of it is all just sort of up here now, and it doesn't feel like it needs to be externalized in quite that same way.
What did you mean about giving yourself permission to write and using longhand as a sort of way of brute forcing that?
Yeah. Well, I think if I'm going to spend my life doing this, it has to be good. I think then there was so much hubris involved because I was, writing in my 20s that it was like, this has to be canonical. What I do has to be so good that it lasts. And so why do I think that this garbage that I'm coming up with is going to be worth that? It almost had to be complicated to justify it.
I see.
And I also think that there was, I sort of referenced this phrase, why is it like this and not like that? For any image that I could come with, for any potential starting point, I could also list 10 more different ways that could be. The character could be a different character. We could start at a different moment. It could be from a different point of view. Maybe the language is different, whatever. But there's, an almost infinite set of variables that I could apply to any given page. And so in order to lock that, I have to do something. And the free writing sprints were a workaround, because there's a rule there. I'm a very instructions-based person. And so there's a rule that I can't stop until the timer goes off. And so, if I'm writing in a timed way, then I can brute force my way through it. And then that sort of has to combine with a deep feeling that this is the right starting point. The angle of entry is how I used to think of it. And once I found the angle of entry on a story, I was in there and it was fine, but it would sometimes take me years and years.
Thinking back on doing it like that, was it enjoyable? Like, what was the feeling? Was it hard? Was it fun? Was it exciting?
It was
when you set that timer, are you like, all right, let's just get through, or are you like, all right, this is gonna be great, like 45 minutes will go by really fast?
The time went fast. I loved it when it felt like it clicked. And I think very often when it was a miss, it just felt so bad. But with Dead Boys, really, once I found my way into that first chapter, I very quickly had a sort of bullet point outline of the entire book that stayed pretty consistent. I remember having so much fun. Because I'm doing voices and I'm coming up with characters. I was laughing a lot. It was a book that I had a great deal of amusement just sort of coming up with. So I think it was really enjoyable. And then the editing and the painstaking part, yeah, I think I liked that too. It didn't feel sickening or awful to me to go through all of those versions. I was trying to come up with something that I could read out loud and like the sound of.
Hmm.
And that, as someone who had a theatrical background and obviously read, a lot of Shakespeare and stuff like that when I was a teenager, like I would sit and read entire Shakespeare plays and do all the voices and sit there with a dictionary and look up every word I didn't know. And it was this very nerdy, complicated process, but it was all vocal. And so I think arriving at the music in the end, even if it took that many iterations, there was something that was very satisfying about it. I remember having a lot of fun when I was finally writing Dead Boys. It was just the process leading up to it that felt like absolute hell.
How did you go about figuring out when something was done? And I'm going to put done in quotation marks, but was there a point at which you sort of mentioned being able to read it out loud or feeling the musicality of it? Was that when you started to feel like, okay, I can slow down on the revising if this is ready for other people to read and evaluate?
Well, I could tell because when I printed it out, there would be less and less ink on the page from the red pen, and that was my meter. When I started to leave it alone, and I would be like, "Wow, look at that! There's like 3/4 of a page," and I couldn't come up with anything to mark on it. We must be almost there, and so then I would just do that until there was nothing left, to revise. And when I couldn't come up with any more revisions, then it was done. That was how I knew it was done, and that's why it took so many drafts.
It's an instinct, right? Like it's something that's really hard to explain, but you yourself just sort of can tell.
I could stand the way it sounded or I couldn't. It was very simple for me.
This is a funny question to ask because I was your editor, but you sort of mentioned that the book did go through an editorial process in between when I first read it and when it was published. Did you think it was done originally? Were you expecting that there might be more work to do? And what was that like to hear? Corey loves this book. He would really enjoy working on it with you. He also has a ton of ideas or a ton of notes and suggestions.
Well, so I don't know if you remember, it was probably a lot more significant to me than to you, and you were editing a lot of other books and I was only editing the one. But when you first got it, you sent an email that said, "I really like this. I don't think there's much to do here." And then when we went
Classic
through,
Corey.
so I thought it was done. I did think it was done before you sent that email. I was pretty cocky about the finished product, not least of all because there had been essentially a stage show. There was a series of, I think, 6 or 7 staged readings at a bar in Pittsfield where we ended up having 6 different readers doing the different characters. And we had, Barrington Stage was doing makeup for us and there were props. It was a very involved thing. And so because it had been in front of so many people, at a certain point, I just started thinking, this is done. This is a, final product. Either somebody wants it or they don't. And so, yeah, when you accepted the manuscript and said you didn't really think there was much to do on it, I was like, confirmation. I've got there. I finally arrived at where I'm going. And so when I got the notes on chapter 1, my exact response was devastation and fear, I think. And I remember having a phone call with you. I remember I was pacing in my backyard and trying to act really chill about it. And I was like, so, what would you say changed? Because it sounded like you thought that there was not that much to do. But now, like, it seems kind of like the parts of the manuscript are like all over the garage. And we're taking this apart now at a sentence level. So, like, what changed? And I'm like sweating bullets, but trying to act really cool about it. I remember you said something along the lines of, yeah, it was a lot more interesting once I really got under the hood. And I just thought that there was a lot to do, that there were a lot of little tweaks to do. And I struck some kind of deal with you where I said, if we change the first chapter this much and we read them side by side and we agree that this didn't get better, let's just leave the rest alone and push it out the door. And you were like, yeah, that's fine. And we did the first chapter, and I remember looking at them side by side. I pulled out this was the printed copy that like 50 people have that we used for the readings at E-Bar in Pittsfield, and this is the finished version. When I sat down and I read the 2 chapters side by side, I was like, I don't know what's better and what's worse here. I can tell that the version that we worked on is so much more readable. It's a lot clearer. And now when I look at the two of them side by side, it is not a question that the version that we edited is far superior. But I was just really attached. I think through the process of performance, I had gotten, as attached to it as you would to a script. So it definitely took some doing, but I felt a lot better about it when I read it recently.
And so did your conception or your idea of when a piece is done, did that change at all? Was that like an experience for you to sort of have to reevaluate? Because, who's to say when anything is done? But
Right.
I just sort of wonder if you look at it in a little bit of a different lens now.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, I had a sort of autodidactic experience of learning how to write in the first place that led me to sort of overestimate my own instincts. And once we had gone through the entire process of editing Dead Boys, I mean, first of all, it was really fun to do. Like, I just remember having such a blast working on those scenes with you and coming up with, real reasons for why things were this and not that weren't just ideas that I had, but things that felt like we were developing together. And so that social aspect of the creation really felt like it was important, and it was something that I had always really wanted to have and just had never really figured out how to share with anybody. And I think there was just sort of a point where we had to be done, and that's when it was done. I mean, there is, I think, when it's a complex enough machine, yeah, you could keep working it forever, but at some point you just kind of go, that's pretty cool. I think we're good.
When you read it now, after all of the years you spent thinking about it and 10 years since it was published, what do you read in it? What do you see? What do you like?
So I wouldn't know how to answer that question, except that I did read it recently. I had a meeting that did not go anywhere, as these meetings often do, about adapting it for film. And so I was like, I better know what I'm talking about. It's been a really long time. So I reread it, and I think there are sections of it that I love so much. And there are parts of it where I'm just like, yeah, that doesn't really work for me. So it's really interesting to sort of look at this thing that felt like, if I don't get this published, I don't know if I'll ever write again. And to just sort of see like, oh wow, yeah, there's some really cool stuff here. And I also see a lot that can be improved on. And this feels very much like a first novel. It is beloved to me. I think it's a very weird and unique thing. And I'm very, very fond of it. And a lot of it I think is really funny. And I think that's what I like best about it, is that now I've forgotten enough of it where I read it and it makes me laugh. And I think that's really cool. And I think, structurally for me, it sort of comes apart towards the end, which is hilarious to me because I remember saying over and over again, the ending is the best part. The last third is the best part of this book. And now I read it and I'm like, that's interesting opinion. So that's pretty weird to be the same, person technically, and totally disagree with myself about that.
Gabby, you talk about the process of writing Dead Boys evolved and is no longer necessarily you're going through that same process. Now that you're working on a third book, has it iterated again?
When I took a hiatus from writing, I remember coming back to it and thinking, there was this sort of constant through Dead Boys and through Viscera, which was a feeling like something in need, someone else to read it immediately. And that was great when it was you, Corey, because you had answers. And usually when I was showing people stuff, they would just be like, that's so cool. Well, I don't know, and like, there just wasn't really an answer to like, but is this good enough? Should I move on? So I really wanted to fix that part of my process in the sense that I wanted to write a book all the way through by myself without feeling a need for someone else to approve it. And I was doing research. There's usually a long research phase for any of my books. This one longer than the others because the one that I'm writing now is historical fiction. And a group of writers that I have been lucky enough to be a part of online all started talking about this book called Refuse to be Done by Matt Bell, which is a very open-ended and also very practical guide to writing a novel that is, it's not prescriptive, it just has all the good advice, and you can kind of take it or leave it, but it really, his approach is very specific about writing a first draft and not doing the ironing over thing that I had been doing for so long. And I kind of thought, there are parts of that process that give me a lot of anxiety. There are parts of it that I would like to leave behind. And I think that I can see through the way that he explains it, it's like, instead of writing the first scene and then saying, this doesn't work because of X, Y, Z, no, I'm going back to the beginning and I'm going to rewrite it from a different perspective, or I'm going to rewrite it starting from a different moment or whatever, and doing that for 10 years. Essentially, every time you have one of those ideas, what if this was from this other character's point of view? What if this was present tense instead of past tense? You just do it in the middle of the scene that you're in. And so making those iterations in the process of writing the novel, a lot of times something that seems like it is the first page will end up being someone's backstory that I can use later in a flashback or whatever. So none of it feels wasted, but it is just a completely different process where I have really committed to starting at this point and ending at the ending, and everything else is just a draft. And then the thing that I love most about it is that the recommendation is to read the whole thing through, take notes on what, scenes you wrote. And then the second draft, you just kind of start fresh. And that really makes a lot of sense to me, because one of the things that I noticed over the course of writing things over and over and over again is the stuff that really works you can remember. And you don't necessarily even need to have the piece of paper next to you when you're rewriting it. The things that really work will stick. And so I've just been trusting that this time around. It is a wildly, radically different process for me, but this does seem to be working really well. I'm almost at the end of the first draft. And now I am so excited to revise, because then I get to do all the stuff that I really love to do. So the rest of the book for me is essentially just a treat, because I really, really do enjoy revision, and I'll get to just sort of pick everything apart and be like, why that and not this? Why that and not this? With something that is already worked out.
I find it so interesting, Gabby, that your process has changed so many times, and that I don't get the sense that you hold too many routines or rituals, like really sacrosanct. That's just really cool to hear. And in our conversations with authors has not always been the case.
Yeah.
Is there something about kind of breaking the mold that maybe unleashes some creativity for you?
It's possible. It's hard for me to answer, because between Viscera and now, I essentially just took a huge break. Like 7 years of that, I wasn't writing. I wasn't reading. I wasn't really even, watching movies that had stories in them. It was such a period of total rest of, all of the parts of me that were involved in writing. It was also a time of, personal revolution for me, in the sense that, Viscera was the book that made me realize that I'm trans. And so, coming out as a trans woman and transitioning and going through that publicly as a writer, and all of the backlash and weirdness that sort of ensued from that, I just sort of had to rebuild everything about my life from the ground up. So to me, if I was going to go back to it, it was going to have to be in a new way. Part of me thinks that I could come up with a way, that this is the way that I write novels, and that would work, from this point on. That's possible. And it also does seem to me like the projects that I have in the pipeline that I'm really excited to work on next, I don't see a huge amount of similarity in them structurally, or in terms, certainly thematically, there are things that I'm obsessed with, as I think all writers are. But in terms of what the project is asking from me, the sort of way that it needs to be written, they do seem very different to me. So I think there will always be a lot of change in the process. I think it would have been really different if there had been some immense demand for a Dead Boys too. I think at the time when I finished Dead Boys, all I wanted was, to make a series, to just like keep doing that thing. I think I would have gotten very locked into a process if that's what had happened. And I'm grateful at this point that things went another way, because I do really like what I'm learning, about writing and about the process and about myself as I continue to iterate.
Have you ever tried something that just did not work, that you just thought, no, like I'm not going to do it like this?
I mean, I think unfortunately for me that the answer to that question is that it's writers groups, it's working in the like sort of pipeline. I just have never really been able to work in those sorts of areas. I do feel like that is not necessarily a leak in my process, but it's really limited me in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I think like I've tried a lot of different forms of advice. I think that the traditional, the sort of filmmaker story, I can't remember the name of the book, but the one.
Yeah.
What's the one?
Yeah.
What is that one called?
I can't remember either, but it's the one where it lays out exactly what you have in each act, each scene.
Yeah, that I can't do that. And I think any of the stuff that feels to me, forgive me, a little buzzwordy around like what are the stakes and like coming up with a character who wants something and then make it worse for them, and that stuff just bounces off me completely. So it does seem like a lot of it is just mulching research and coming up with just weird spins on things that I'm researching in nonfiction that are tangential to the story.
Gabby, we could keep talking for such a long time. I have one more question before we get into the rapid fire. But before I do that, I feel like I need to go on the record and clarify, even though there was a good amount of sort of back and forth between us in the editorial process, every single idea and every single good idea from those books was 100% yours. I mean, as I remember the editing process, it's really helpful sometimes to have somebody who can sort of coax things out of you. But I just remember that you, both through Dead Boys and Viscera, had so many ideas swirling in your head that sometimes I would just sort of say, yeah, this chapter's cool, but like, what if it was a little bit cooler? And you'd be like, I know exactly what to do. And you would go back, and when you would turn it back in, I'd be like, yep, you're right. This chapter is a lot cooler.
Yeah, you ask questions, and I think that you were really good at asking the right questions in the right way to just sort of unlock, what I do naturally, which is riff, and so my process with something when I'm looking at it and I'm like, this doesn't feel like it's working, I will just make a bulleted list of 5 other ways it could be, and one of those will just feel like it sings. And so you just had an external sense of which things weren't working. And I think I had a tendency, especially at that time, to just kind of get lost in the sauce. So the questions were just just hugely helpful. And I remember mostly we just had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I remember that too. And I'm very excited to see what you're cooking up next. My last question is, if you could have any author talk about their process on this show, dead or alive, doesn't matter, who would you most want to hear from? Who are you most curious about how they wrote or how they approach their craft?
Yeah, I have for a long time been fairly obsessed with the Chilean author Roberto Bolaño, who died quite some time ago. There are parts of his process that I'm totally fascinated by. That's probably my number one. There's also a more contemporary author who wrote Our Share of Night. Mariana Enriquez is an Argentine writer that is like a really dense literary horror that is sort of an intergenerational horror story that is one of the most fascinating things I've ever read, and a book that I just keep ceaselessly shoving on people. So yeah, I think if it was anybody who's alive and writing today, it would definitely be her. I think she's phenomenal, and I would love to know more about her process, because she does seem like she works a lot of contemporary news and political circumstances into what also feels like a very rich sort of inner phantasmagoria that I'm just really fascinated by how she achieves the effects that she does and what her process is.
Gabby, I've got Bolaño on my 2026 reading list. I've never
Nice.
read any of his stuff, but I've wanted to for a long time, and I think I have copies of Savage Detectives and 2066 or 2666.
Yep, 2666.
One of them will get read this year, I think. I hope. They're long books.
Well,
but
if you want a starting point, I always recommend Distant Star because it's like 115 pages or something.
Okay, cool.
So he's got a couple of shorter ones. That one and By Night in Chile are two very short novellas that are easier entry points because those two are doorstops.
All right, let's do our rapid fire questions and then we'll wrap things up. What is one aspect of writing that you think you're great at?
I like my dialogue. I feel comfortable with dialogue. I feel like I am most in my element when people are talking.
It's the Shakespearean.
Yeah, the
teenager,
and I'm trying to soliloquize a little less in my writing these days, but I still really do like to get my characters talking. That's my favorite.
What's one aspect of writing you think you're bad at?
I don't feel like I am a huge fan of the way that I have handled structure, particularly third acts. That is something I'm really trying to strengthen.
What would you do if you weren't a writer?
Well, I can tell you because I was not writing for quite a long time and I was mostly playing video games. But that also had something to do with 2020. So yeah, hard to say. I think the answer is probably gaming in some way though. When I wasn't writing, I took Magic the Gathering very seriously and was like going to, competitive events. And so that's sort of like I'm using all the parts of my brain and it's competitive and I'm, really trying to hone this thing I'm doing. I think I probably would have leaned harder into that. It does feel totally incompatible with writing, in the sense that it is also just a massive time suck and you can't do both in a serious way.
External deadlines or internal pressure?
Oh, why not both? No, I love an external deadline, but I am very far from that world right now. Internal pressure seems to be doing just fine. I feel like my internal pressure is decades long and tends to be if I'm not working as hard as I can whenever I have the energy, how am I possibly going to get these projects done with the time I have left on the clock? So the existential pressure of just feeling like I have so many ideas, that does feel like plenty at the moment.
Long sentences or short ones?
I do like long sentences better. But the thing is, like, I do like when there's like 3 long sentences and 1 short one, and then a couple more long ones. And then a bunch of short ones. I like to vary it, but I certainly have a penchant for longer sentences.
Music, TV, podcasts in the background, or do you write with silence?
Music, almost exclusively. Never TV. And yeah, this book that I'm writing right now, I think, is the first time that I have ever written an entire novel to almost only one album, which is Diamond Jubilee by Cindy Lee, which is almost 3 hours long, but that's just on loop through the entire writing process. Dead Boys and Viscera were playlists, so they had a lot of commonalities. Dead Boys in particular was a lot of Red by King Crimson, and yeah, there were a couple of others, but sort of definitely in that proggy, sludgy guitar kind of space.
What's your go-to procrastination method?
Oh boy, I don't procrastinate. When I'm like, if I'm writing, I'm writing. Like I just sit down, it's on, and I'll do 45 minutes and then I'll see how I'm feeling. Yeah, I don't really procrastinate anymore. I'm so sorry. This is devastating information, I am sure.
Well, I'm just really jealous.
Yeah, inspiring.
Because I go somewhere, like I'll go to the library or whatever, and I usually have put my phone in my backpack or whatever and zipped it up, and so there's no coming back.
We all have a little bit to learn from that. That's all the questions that we have. Gabby, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.